Um, a couple of thoughts of what you said. The first, it's easy when you have such a broad overview to mention things that may be missing, right? So, but the first point, since you started there, was about the apparent inconsistency in the undernourishment and the malnutrition trends. Now thinking through the numbers that are related to undernourishment and what's the main message of the last SOFI report is an increase in the numbers of hungry people. Now, whether we agree, we probably agree that those numbers are flawed, but having been part of those calculations, I'll still defend them to some extent. But I think maybe if you look at the causes, which I think are there, the numbers tick up particularly in areas where two things coincide. It's climate change or weather shocks and conflict. So the one element I missed in addressing sort of for the research agenda is conflict, and maybe also look beyond the national averages and how things are moving, particularly also looking, because this is happening within particular regions within countries, even if the rest of the country may not be doing so badly. So that's one question. The second is on, as also since you've been part of the formulation of the SDG agenda itself, so the core message of the agenda is about transformative change, and probably it's all underlying whatever you said, but you didn't mention it. You also started with talking about inclusive growth and sustainable growth rather than about transformation for sustainable development. So shouldn't we emphasize that much more, and also that should be part of the the thinking, what you called about the system approach or the policy coherence, which I think would be important. Some of the things you mentioned, you can look separately at the uptick in the protection, nominal protection rates, or the support even to agricultural sectors. But if you if you link it to what you said about finance, you could also say, well, if we would use all the subsidies that go into agriculture in better ways, we may not need all that extra finance. We can just set the incentives right, and that may be where a lot of our study and focus should be on. Let me stop here. I have more questions, but let me stop here.
Those are really thoughtful questions. The first, so the principal reason why we are not doing as well as we could and should on the SDGs, that very first chart that I put out about the number of people who were essentially being left behind. The principal reason why they are being left behind is because they are residing in countries with features of conflict or other features of fragility, sometimes climate change, sometimes natural resource degradation, etc. And we can identify those countries, and I've done some work and tried to popularize a term called severely off-track countries. But there are a bunch of countries where things are not getting better, they're actually getting worse. And there are not a few of them. There are something like 30 plus, not worse in all dimensions, but in 30 plus countries with quite significant populations, things are really just not moving in a positive direction at anywhere like the speed which would be necessary. So even talking about acceleration, I mean, you've got to be moving in order to accelerate. Actually, you don't, but sorry. So there's definitely a close link and relationship. What is much less clear to me is why we're not seeing equivalent upward ticks in extreme poverty rates, even though we know that in these places extreme poverty is certainly not going down, etc. But that's all factored into the global aggregates. And yet we are seeing upward ticks on the hunger numbers. And I would have expected those two series to be much more closely correlated than they appear to be. And so I just don't really understand exactly why, but Schengen has the answer, so he's going to explain later. I do think it's hugely important to look at the subnational stuff, and so that's actually where my own work is going. So I'm trying to understand things called convoluted neural networks, which is all this machine learning to train satellite, train programs so that you can decipher the satellite imagery. But I suspect that we will have relatively decent subnational, meaning grids of 1 square kilometer population maps, within a year or two. This doesn't any longer seem to be, from a technical point of view, impossible to do. Certainly in rural areas, a little bit harder in urban areas, because you can't differentiate so easily in urban areas between the rich and the poor. So that's going to be really important in driving the subnational agenda, because then you can start to actually see where people are and be much more focused. I think we've traditionally thought about distribution. So if you think about distribution, what do? We distribute basically from young to old, from rich people to poor people, and from healthy people to sick people. We haven't really thought about distribution from a place-based perspective. And I think that's going to be one of the big new things. And a lot of this geospatial mapping is going to permit us to do things like that. Finally, on transformation. I avoid it because I don't quite understand what it means. Not that I understand these other words like inclusive growth and all the rest of it. But there's one area where I do think that transformation is important, and that's in the financial sector. If we get the incentives right in the financial sector, and there are movements towards that with, starting with green bonds, but going well beyond, and you'll hear Michael Bloomberg basically launching the metrics of an effort that he's been funding in the US called the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, which will be corporate metrics of sustainability done on a harmonized way across different companies. Once we start to get more metrics that will actually change financial systems, and we change the way in which asset managers allocate finance, that will actually be transformational change. The other stuff of kind of, movement of agriculture to manufacturing to services that we used to talk about as being structural transformation, I just think that that's just nowadays standard what we think about in terms of development. And so I don't like to use that word transformational. And also partly in Africa with the Africa thing, I think they have a fetish about industrialization in Africa, which I'm not sure is exactly where we are headed. Manufacturing globally is not going to be more than about 10% of any country's economy, and so we should focus maybe also on the other 90% rather than being held up on the 10%.
So I'm wondering, who should I call on next? Yeah, you're right. I should call on Schengen next. Go ahead.
No, Homi, I don't have the answer to your first question. I think I have been struggling on the divergence between the hunger and the poverty number. I think it's a shame, to be frank. The shame of the World Bank and the FAO that do not produce a coherent data on poverty and hunger. For example, how can somebody be hungry but not poor? Yeah. I just cannot imagine that. That's, for example, China. The FAO data, latest FAO data shows that China still has 130 million hungry people. But in the meantime, the World Bank data says China only has maybe 30 million to 50 million poor people. I mean, this is a great myth to me. So I think, Homi, maybe Brookings, IFPRI, the World Bank, FAO should sit together. Let's look at that issue, deal with that issue very seriously before we even offer the solutions to hunger and poverty. So that's my number one sort of, not necessarily an answer, maybe a proposal. Now, you were advising Ban Ki-moon on all the 17 SDG goals, by the way. I still do not understand on the SDG 2, zero malnutrition. You know, zero malnutrition means zero overweight, obesity. There's no way to do that. In fact, if you try to argue for zero overweight, obesity, you will dilute, not necessarily you, but the UN will dilute our effort in reducing hunger and malnutrition. So I wanted to hear from you about your reflection.
So I'm almost sure we did not have zero obesity in the report that I submitted to, but there are political negotiations that went into the SDGs, and what emerges is also a political document. It is aspirational as well as being so basically you win some, you lose some. But there is a real question of using goals to motivate. And I think that they have to be so-called stretch goals and targets. Otherwise, you don't get the kind of accelerations that I think that we were all looking for in the SDGs. But if they're too far away, then people just give up. And we are in danger right now of people giving up on the SDGs. And that's something really real and something that needs to be fought against. And so one of the, I think, critical functions that research can contribute is to give people hope that these can be achieved, if indeed our research suggests that that is the case.
Thank you. Other questions? John?
I wanted to follow up a little bit. You talked about
Your
John
full name.
McDermott. I'm the director of a CGIAR program called Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. And I wanted to follow up. You had some suggestions on system thinking, but I wonder if there's some system actions, and do, for example, different sectors need to work together to achieve some of these things, and what might be the constraints, or what do we need to do about them? What are the critical areas where we need them to work together, others where we shouldn't care maybe?
So to me, there are a couple of things on the systems thinking. One is to think about what's the right universe, but the other also is just to organize one's own system in breakdown. What are the component parts and issues on which we need to get answers? And so I think of the health people as having really moved furthest in terms of all sectors on real systems thinking. And by that I mean they now have a very serious effort on data. They have a very serious effort on peer-reviewed journal articles. So the BMJ, Lancet, I think 90% of all refereed papers that mention the SDGs are on health. They obviously have been very successful with funding from various sources. So you see where I'm headed. I think that one of the big things about systems thinking should be, how do we organize ourselves? And Shengmen's suggestion of saying we should get a bunch of people together and really say, this is a problem. We need to know the answer to this problem. Put the right people in the room, get a commitment, solve the problem insofar as it can be, move on to the next. That's a little bit of the feedback loop and problem solving of systems thinking that I think we could really use. In the sort of the food and nutrition space, I think it's kind of we put it all together. It may be that those should be separated. Maybe.
You know, I bet everybody agrees with everything that's been said up here so far.
Except for that last
Except for that one, well. No, I think there's probably lots of questions out there. Let's take 3 questions this time. You may?
Yeah.
Oh, your full name, please.
Yeah, thank you for your.
You may, your name and your position?
Yeah, my name is Yumei Zhang from IFPRI Beijing office, also from Chinese Academic of Agricultural Science. Yeah, first I want to mention the Chinese government has already changed the agricultural policy support policy already. They canceled the price support for corn, cotton, rapeseed since 2014 or 2015, and also reduced the minimum purchase price support for rice and wheat since 2006. So the Chinese government already changed the policy, producer support policy, and try to reduce the market distortion. The second question is about, I'm wondering how much impact the Chinese government's agricultural producer support policy to the subsidy to the global market, because I think China is a net importer. So many people worried about China import too much and will raise the global market price. If Chinese government give producer subsidy to the domestic farmers, so maybe China can import less from the global market. So as I'm wondering how much what's the impact to the global market of China's producer subsidy? Thank you so much.
Let's get 2 more questions. Channing?
Hello, Channing Art. I'm the director of the Environment Production Technology Division, and I think you were part of a group that called for a data revolution, and I just wanted to know what you thought. How's it going?
And if you couldn't guess, I think Channing is one of our big proponents of working on big data and utilizing that data for analysis of production, environment, climate change, all sorts of stuff. One more question. Rajul?
Thank you very much, Homi. This is Rajul Pandya-Loch. Question for you. You talked about how the development agenda is evolving, how the research agenda is evolving. And I'm curious, how do you see the way in which research is undertaking evolving? Thank you.
Let's take those 3 questions, and then I will be sure to call on Xinqian Diao.
So great to hear that China's already starting to bring down producer support. I always used to use China as an example of a country that had had really successful development. Without having to distort agriculture. So I was especially disappointed when they changed tax in the 2000s to start to introduce these kinds of things. But, you know, like all market distortions. China is a large part of the global market. Our objective is not to keep global food prices low. Our objective is to have global food prices reflect the reality of what it costs to produce and hence what it costs to consume. So I have no problems with China doing, a range of things within China, but I would not agree with the statement that because of these kinds of protections, China imports less and therefore is doing the rest of the world a big favor. I don't think that that's a reasonable way to think about the economics of food. The data revolution, I think, is something which is not doing so badly. And so I think that it has given rise to a real effort to move data to a much more granular level. So the geospatial stuff that I mentioned, call detail records, but also citizen data. What I think we are starting to see is many more people in more localized places starting to use and think about data. And I think the data revolution is also transforming the ability to communicate data. So you now have images of, well, what do middle class consumers in different countries what do they actually consume? People going into their houses, there are these little video clips. There's something called what's it called? The something street that is on these websites. There's just a lot more communication of the way in which different people live, and I believe that that's building a demand for policy improvements in lots of different places as they see exactly what the potential is for their own communities. So I think we are getting a great deal more data, and I think we're slowly starting to use it, not so much in government and in government ministries. But I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. And, I think that we will rapidly get to a day where we will not look to household surveys as the core basis for understanding what's going on in people's lives. We'll be looking at a whole range of other proxies, which will be much more timely. And the timeliness in many ways is the critical element for policy making. So, I mean, today, the World Bank will generate a report talking about poverty in 2013. It's just not interesting for a policymaker. So we have to move with the times, and we have to come up with proxies for that. Rajul, on the evolution of research, if it's not hard research, we're finding, certainly at Brookings, that research is entering into a very difficult period. People certainly don't like to fund research. It's almost become a dirty word. If it's not something kind of hard and tangible. I mean, it's one thing to do research in the engineering sense of producing a better mousetrap or a better widget. But increasingly what we hear is, well, if you've got a good idea, just try it. Why do you have to do research? Try it, see, get market feedback, come back. I don't think that works for many of the big macro problems that we tend to look at. But then I'm a bit stuck in my ways.
One last question, Shin-Chen? I have to do that.
I don't want to be the last question. My name is Xin Dio.
The mic's not working.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned smallholder in your slides. It surprised me. And especially you mentioned in front of IFPRI, it's an issue at IFPRI hard, but still I want to ask you, are you serious for this question? And then what's your thought, a new thought for smallholder issue today? Yeah.
So yes, I am serious because I think that, just in terms of numbers, this is the heart of the problem we're trying to solve. And so I said that because when I say beneficiaries, ultimately, I think that much of the research has to be aimed at how do we improve the lot of smallholders and their families and small farms across the world. And one thing that I'm actually quite encouraged by is that there are maybe now opportunities in smallholder finance that we never saw before. It's been a very long-standing problem that we've tried to crack, and digital technologies might be starting, new payment platforms might be starting to unlock that. And so when I see what Tencent and Alipay are doing with small farms as well as small businesses in Southeast Asia, I go, wow. And if they can do that, and we can start to take those kinds of technologies into other places of the world, maybe there's a chance that one of the big issues that people have long talked about as a smallholder problem, that we can actually make some progress on. Let's see. But it's certainly new. It came out of left field. It's not bank related, but it's a possible solution.
Well, thank you very much, Homi. I think that was a fascinating discussion. We could go for a lot longer, but somebody running this show here would be really upset with me if I did. I'm looking at you, Rajul. The screen says -151. That means
blue and it's kind of dark.
Yes. It's really scary when it's looking at us like this. So thank you very much. Let's give Homi a big round of applause.